Welcome to this edition of Labor Vision. I'm Bob Delaney, Executive Director of the Institute for Labor Studies and Research. Labor Vision, a production of the Institute, focuses on topics of importance to working Rhode Islanders. We hope you enjoy this edition.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this special event from the Rhode Island Labor History Society. My name is Patrick Crowley, and I'll be presenting a piece of Rhode Island labor history that's not really well known, and I hope that will change after tonight. So first, let me say thank you to the Rhode Island Labor History Society for hosting this event. I really appreciate it. See a lot of members here, so that's a good thing. I want to especially thank the Team Cis Local 251 for the use of their hall and helping get things set up, so thank you. Matt Tybee, Stu Mundy, and everyone else from the local that was instrumental in getting us to be here today. Here's what I plan to do. I plan to talk for about 30 minutes, and then open the floor for questions and discussions. There's a lot about this story that I won't talk about tonight unless it comes out in the questions, because otherwise we'd be here for 3 or 4 hours, which I know is not everyone's example of a good time, but especially during the Stanley Cup. Well noted, President Nee. So hopefully when I'm done, we can have a good discussion and get everyone out in time for the puck drop. So to give you a sense of where I'm going with this, I want to start off with some preliminary remarks. I'm going to briefly share some background about the work at Fields Point during World War II. We'll then talk about the experiences of the workers at the shipyard during the war, especially about the members of Local 308 of the Boilermakers Union and the struggles that they encountered, fought, and won. And finally, I'm going to end with some concluding remarks about what I think we can learn from the story. So to begin, I want to talk about a pet peeve I have about labor history. I think too much of it lionizes the CIO and either ignores or misrepresents the work of the AFL. And I think that that's a problem because, as most folks in this room know, they were two separate organizations for a long time. From the time the CIO formed in 1935 until it merged with the AFL in 1955, they operated differently. But I think for various reasons that we can get into in the question and answer part, I think labor history's focus on the CIO has produced some negative consequences, not just for the historiography or the history of our movement, but also for the work of organizers. And I hope that becomes part of the discussion a little bit later. One thing about that story that I think often gets missed is this part. Most people don't know it, I didn't know it, but during the years of World War II, broadly defined 1939 through 45, the AFL organized more workers across the United States than the CIO did. They had more individual elections. They had elections for bigger groups of workers. And really, the CIO was the junior partner during that phase of American history when it came to organizing people. And that's oftentimes when we think about the history of organizing in the mid-20th century to our peak of a movement back in the mid to late 50s, it's the CIO that gets a lot of the attention. The AFL does not. And I think that there's a lot of reasons for that, but I think it's important to highlight that as part of this talk because it's an important feature. Now, I found that out from a key source that I'm going to use in my presentation tonight. There was a book that came out about 2006 by a writer named Andrew Kirsten, and he wrote a book called Labor's Homefront. And what Kirsten does in this book is make clear that across the country and across industries, during the war years, the AFL perfected a tool of organizing that was pretty innovative at the time. Now, we would probably refer to it as a project labor agreement. But for the time period, it was a radical new approach to organizing that the AFL was able to use to the benefit of the working class. It's also in Kirsten's book that I came across this story tonight about Boilermakers Local 308. It was only mentioned very briefly in the book, maybe a page and a quarter at most. And it was this story about what took place right around the corner from here that I know I had never heard about, and when I was talking with some other folks that are part of society, they hadn't really heard about it. Many folks had heard about Fields Point and the building of the ships in World War II, and many people had relatives or family or friends or older brothers and sisters that may have worked there. But there's a lot to be mined about what took place during 1942 to 1945, right around the corner from us, and this is only a small piece of it. Now, luckily, when I went looking for more information about this Boilermakers Local 308, I discovered at Providence College an entire archive that had loads of material about it, primary sources from the workers themselves and from people that were involved in the organizing there. And at URI, the same thing. The company produced a newspaper, a biweekly newspaper called the Yardarm. And some of the pictures that are on the screen here are from that paper. But that's housed at URI. And apart from a few mentions in some obscure scholarly articles and normally about other things, the story isn't told. So what I hope to do tonight is to share this amazing story, because there's a lot of parts of it that I think are relevant today. Most importantly, it's out of these dusty archives is a story that is about understanding working class and cross-community solidarity, because fundamentally that's what this story is about. So let me tell you the story of Boilermakers Local 308 and the fight against Jim Crow unionism. The story is about how a young man named George Smoke and his co-workers, both black and white, got together to challenge one of the most racist structures in the American labor movement, the auxiliary union. I think George is someone that we should all come to know and count as one of our labor heroes. So, like I said, there's been very little written about this. What is written normally talks about how Thurgood Marshall, the future Supreme Court justice, rode into Providence one day, filed some motions in court, and tried to save the labor movement from its wicked ways. And while part of that is true, it really is a story about an interracial organizing drive at the shop floor level, led by workers of color. Now, I want to emphasize that point. It was led by workers of color in a campaign to fight against racial oppression while we were building ships to fight fascism across the world. The connections that these workers made in their own communities and at their workplace, I think there's hope and things that we can learn from. In the spring of 1942, the Navy set up shop in Fields Point on the Providence waterfront and hired a California company named Walsh Kaiser to build the ships that would be used in the Pacific Theater mostly. Thousands of workers were hired, including 3,000 women and about 500 African Americans. The women's part of the story has never really been told, and it's something that someone should probably really look into. Eventually, the shipyard would employ close to 20,000 people. Interestingly, the Providence Urban League was integral in the hiring process right from the start. James Williams, who was an organizer for the Providence Urban League, actually had an office in the shipyard hiring shack. And the whole idea was to make sure that he was responsible for helping to hire people of color into these relatively lucrative production jobs in the middle of the war. In the summer of 1942, there was a union election. The choice was between the AFL and the CIO. Now, I know that sounds a little odd. Why would it be not between the laborers and the Teamsters and the Boilermakers? It seems to be the case that there was some kind of agreement that the two main union organizations would be the only choices on the ballot. So you had a choice between the AFL and the CIO. The AFL won. And what took place next was the AFL Metal Trades Division negotiated a master agreement at the place, and then the affiliated unions began to sign people up individually. So it's an innovative tactic at the time. Now, the Boilermakers were the single largest union. They had close to 10,000 of the workers there. But the laborers were there, Teamsters Local 251 was there, the iron workers were there. Many of the unions that are still around today had a presence at this plant. In the winter of 1943, the contract is signed, and the unions start the process of organizing as local unions. It was reported by some contemporary sources that while there was some initial standoffishness, white and black workers got along together, and the black workers were welcomed into the local unions with open arms and treated just like any other member. This place at Fields Point seems to be one long chaos stream from the time it opened. And it wasn't just because of the frantic pace of building ships to go out and fight in the war. From the very start, things just didn't work right. The first contractor that they hired was a company called Ream Manufacturing. Ream had never built a ship before. And they still never built a ship because they never produced a single vessel that was seaworthy. So sometime in the late 1943, the Navy cancels their contract with ships still half built in the rafters and turns it over to Walsh Kaiser. Walsh Kaiser was a California company. It was, Providence was their only East Coast port of operation. And they built what were called Liberty ships. They were frigates. They were tender ships. They would be the ones that would take troops back and forth to shore. They'd take supplies back and forth, deliver arms, and they were floating tin cans, more or less. And they were very dangerous to work on and very dangerous to build. There were also several Wildcat Strikes during the first year of the plant. This was despite the AFL taking a no-strike pledge. Now, the first Wildcat Strike that took place was because the Boilermakers were trying to claim jurisdiction over the ironworkers and 150 jobs. And the ironworkers took their members out for a couple of days to make sure that they wouldn't be absorbed into the larger Boilermakers Union. There was a second strike in the summer of 1943 by the Boilermakers themselves. The first shift workers went on strike for 4 hours because they were upset that someone on the night shift, a man named Americo Petrini, won the election for local union president. And the story behind the story was that the guards let the night shift workers out 15 minutes early so they could go out and vote, and therefore the day shift workers felt as if their guy, got the short end of the stick, so they went out on strike. As you'll see from the rest of the story, Brother Petrini, the local president, would remain controversial throughout the entire process. But shortly after the first union contract was signed, Local 308 members started to notice that things were starting to change and not in a good way. Racial discrimination started to come into the workyard in a way that it hadn't before. Now, it's important to note that at the time, Providence was still very much a segregated city. For example, while formal discrimination and public accommodations had been outlawed about 50 years earlier, blacks could still only sit in the balconies at local theaters. There was at least one restaurant that was reported that whenever there was a black patron, the staff would break the dishes and the glasses so that they wouldn't be shared with white patrons that would come in later. And it was all too soon that this kind of discrimination found its way into the shipyard. Now, this is a good point for me to kind of break things out a little bit for a minute. What's an auxiliary union? An auxiliary union can be summed up very simply. Auxiliary members paid the same amount of dues, got half the benefits, and none of the rights. Now, at this time, the AFL, in a lot of different ways, was a racist organization. 15 different affiliates wouldn't allow African Americans to be members at all, and 9 others had this similar kind of auxiliary union scheme that was put in place. It was also at the time when, across the country, African American workers, led by A. Philip Randolph, were starting to agitate about making sure that wartime production facilities, didn't discriminate against people regardless of their skin color. So across the country, the NAACP and the various urban leagues were starting to call attention to this Jim Crow kind of unionism. One of the worst offenders of this practice with auxiliaries was the Boilermakers Union. One government official was quoted as describing the Boilermakers' discrimination as, quote, not only a source of embarrassment to fair-minded labor leaders and businessmen alike, but also a challenge to the authority and to the principles of democratic government. In their journal, which is one of the covers you can see in the screen, They actually ran a regular monthly column called Uncle Twiz Says, which was basically a minstrel character trying to give work advice to people in this really awful racist dialect. There's the cover of the journal there. In Newport News, Virginia, the Boilermakers made sure that the black workers were paid 50% of what the white workers were making. In Tampa, they called the Klan to visit black workers' houses after the workers had the temerity to protest some of the working conditions they were under. 300 African-American workers were fired from a Walsh-Kaiser yard in Portland, Oregon, and another 165 of them were fired from a Walsh-Kaiser yard in San Francisco. So with all of this in mind, the African-American organizers like James Williams set about trying to make sure that the same problems didn't surface in Providence because things had started off so well. Williams had first written a letter to the president of the Boilermakers Union in Kansas City asking him not to set up the auxiliary in Providence. He never got a response. He then went to the federal U.S. Employment Service and asked them to intervene, but they said they couldn't do anything about it. And then he wrote a letter to Congressman John Fogerty asking him to intervene. And while Fogerty had given some initial impression of wanting to help and try to see what he could do, in the end, he didn't do anything either. So as a result, the workers figured out they had to figure out things on their own. Williams luckily met George Smoke. Now, George was already an activist. He served as the secretary for the NAACP-affiliated, quote, Colored American Club in his hometown of Fall River. And he was considered the lead man in his department. He was born in Birmingham, Alabama in 1907, and he eventually made his way north, and he became a teacher at the Mount Vernon School in Lincoln, Rhode Island. But as World War II broke out, he ended up taking a job at the shipyard because it paid a lot more than what being a teacher would pay. So as Williams was organizing in Providence and running into roadblocks everywhere, George Smoke actually traveled to New York City on his own to meet with the Urban League officials there at their headquarters. And it was this confluence of people all starting to get involved in the issue at the same time. So the Providence Urban League was contacted by the national office, who put him in touch with George. And that's when things start to get interesting. So in the September of 1943, the Boilermakers business agent, a man named John McGuire, started to hand out new membership cards to all of the African-American workers. When the workers had first signed up, they all signed a white card. Now all the black workers were given a pink card, designating them as part of the auxiliary. They were also told that even though they'd already been in the union, were already paying dues, that they would have to pay a $13 reinstatement fee for the glory of being able to join the auxiliary union that had no rights. After Williams and Smoke first met, they decided that they needed to confront the local union about this process to make sure that if there was going to be an auxiliary, what are the facts, because nothing was being shared with the members. So in September of 1943, George Smoke took to the floor of the Union Hall and demanded to be recognized. When he got to the microphone, he asked a series of questions. He wanted to know if it was true that an auxiliary union was being formed. If so, he demanded who formed it, where was it formed, who voted for it. He wanted to know if it was true that the African-American workers were going to have to pay this $13 initiation fee, and why it was so if they had already been members in good standing. Now, he didn't get any answers from the international representatives who were running the meeting. So another worker, a man named Jack Norton, he was a white member of Boilermakers Local 308. He took to the floor, and he put forward a motion before the body that the local union would admit any member regardless of skin color. Now, this is 1943 in an international union that part of its constitution was to make sure that there was segregation. And right here in Providence, the white workers started to join with the black workers to say, you know what, that's not the way we're going to do it here. Now, I point out that Norton is white for a couple of different reasons. The first is In the historiography of this story, if Norton appears at all, they list him as a black man. Now, the archives make it clear, and some of the things that are on the screen show that, the Providence Urban League archives has a lot of notations about things that Norton either said or wrote, and every time they did it, they made sure to point out, white member. Right? But I think getting his identity correct helps transform this story, because it now becomes a story not just some disgruntled African-American workers trying to fight a racist structure on their own and going to court to try to make a difference. Now it becomes a story of white and black workers struggling together and identifying with each other's struggle in a way that takes it from simply a battle of discrimination to one about cross-union, cross-culture solidarity. And this is something I think, as we talk about it some more, we can learn from. See, not only was the labor interracial solidarity unique to Providence, it was also an example of the black workers leading the way and the white workers following. That's not a story that often gets told in American labor history. And I think it's an important reason why, if we think about the powerful forces that are trying to divide the American working class today, it's something that we need to keep in mind about how we need to overcome the barriers that the powers that be try to put up in front of us. So the next step after the meeting that Smoke talked about was to see what the local leadership was willing to do about this issue. James Williams met with the local president, Americo Petrini, an Italian-American immigrant, and he was incredibly excited to find out that Petrini was also in support of the integrated local union. Williams pledged to fight with the black workers to fight alongside Petrini and against the auxiliary. And Williams also pledged to help Petrini get reelected in the upcoming December election by campaigning amongst the black workers for Petrini's reelection. It's not clear why there had to be another election in December, since there was just one in the summer. And there's nothing in the literature that explains why that might be the case. But I'm pretty sure that if a local election causes a wildcat strike, things were pretty unsettled, and maybe the idea was this December election was going to settle the idea of who's going to be leading the local union. As we'll see, it really did not settle matters at all. So while Williams was working with Petrini, George Smoke started to agitate on the shop floor with his co-workers. In November, he stood for nomination to the Boilermakers Convention that was supposed to take place in January of 1944. Only to be told by the international representative, a man named William Buckley, who would go on to be the Secretary-Treasurer of the Boilermakers, that as a member of the auxiliary, he was forbidden to run for office and even to attend the convention. Undaunted, however, George wrote a letter to his fellow workers at the shipyard with the help of Williams and encouraged all of them to vote for Petrini's slate.
The final part of this evening's celebration is the awarding of the prestigious Eagle Awards. It really is the nicest trophy anybody could give you, and believe me, it's a gorgeous piece of work. This year, 3 exceptional individuals will join an elite group listed in your program book. Each award winner has distinguished him or herself through their working lives as leaders who have demonstrated the highest ideals of leadership in the workplace and in the community. Their merits, as you're about to hear, will make it abundantly clear why each was selected for the honor which will now be bestowed unto them. The first Eagle Award will be presented to Andrew Cortes, Executive Director of Building Futures. This award will be presented by Justin Kelly. One little thing about Andrew Cortes. If you're the smartest person in the room and Andrew Cortes walks in, you are now the second smartest person in the room.
Hi, I'm Justin Kelly. I'm the business representative for the Rhode Island Painters and Allied Trades, Local Union 195 of District Council 11 of the International Union of Painters and Allied Trades. And I'm here today to give a special shout out to someone who's played a huge role in my life, whether he knows it or not, and that's Andrew Cortes. Andrew Cortes is the founder and executive director of the pre-apprenticeship program, Building Futures. But Andrew's so much more than that. Andrew is originally from California, and he joined the Carpenters Union when he was a young man, actually emancipating himself from his family. Moving forward, Andrew learned all of the different craft skills that carpenters perform. Andrew can do anything from rough carpentry to finished carpentry, although I think he likes that historic restoration stuff the most. In the past, Andrew's told me that his favorite project he ever worked on was the San Francisco Opera House, which must be amazing. Andrew, moving to Rhode Island in 2002, became the construction manager with Youth Build, moving on to become its director. Andrew is somebody who's not only skilled with his hands, but also an intellectual. If you don't believe me, ask him to play a game of chess someday. In 2007, Andrew founded Building Futures. Building Futures, the pre-apprenticeship program, is something that has touched not only my life, but the lives of hundreds of other young men and women throughout the state of Rhode Island. It's taken and moved myself and others from a situation of precarity and poverty into a solid middle-class living. The program has graduated over 300 individuals into 11 different trades, where they've gone on to hone their crafts and skills to become journey people. Andrew now resides in Smithfield, Rhode Island, and really, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for everything you've done for me and for everyone else. Thanks, Andrew.
Action.
Andrew, thanks for everything you've done for me.
And for me, and for everybody at Building Futures.
Thanks, brother.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. My wife was smart enough to tell me I don't actually have to speak. I could just come up here, say thank you, and leave. I'll just say a couple of things. One, I stand here with a lot of gratitude today because I look out and I see the labor movement that brought us to this point now. And two, a lot of gratitude for our graduates because when I look to their faces, I see the leaders of tomorrow. Because the labor movement has the power to transform people's lives and has consistently since its inception. The same is true for me. I tried to join my union at 16. They told me to go away. I was too young. I came back at 17, and I was in. It was my pathway to economic security. That happened through apprenticeship. That's the power of the labor movement. So the least I could do was found an organization that extends that opportunity to others. And I'm proud to do that. For those of you who have not seen our t-shirts or our hoodies, besides Building Futures, there's two messages on it. One is right across the chest, and it says honor labor. And I mean that. Not just one labor union or another labor union, but labor. Because there's dignity and respect in working with your hands and your mind. And the second thing those sweatshirts say, it's right down the sleeve. Solidarity by design. Somebody once told me that couldn't be done. Building Futures shows that that's not true. It can be done, it has been done, and it should be done again. So, we took the apprenticeship model that labor has honed and extended it beyond to new industries and occupations, so I have additional chances to partner with labor unions and extend the great pathways to economic security to others in need. And for that, I thank you, and I appreciate the honor. Good night.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Labor Vision. We appreciate your input and encourage your comments. Labor Vision can be seen on this channel 3 times each week: Tuesday at 7 p.m., Thursday at 8 p.m., and Saturday at 5 p.m.